Okay, hello everybody. Today we're here in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 in the Cessna 152. We're at my home field of Whiskey Bravo Whiskey, Wyoming Valley, and today we're going to fly the pattern. As a student pilot, flying the pattern is something you do a lot. It's the way that you practice all of the skills that you need for managing your airspeed, pitch, power, and coming in for good landings. When I started flight simming, I vaguely understood the pattern, but I had so many questions about where do you turn, what speeds do you fly, how do you know how far you are from things, and hopefully we'll answer those today. So it should be an awesome flight. Let's hop into the pilot seat and get started. Next we'll check all of our switches are off, the circuit breakers are all in, mixture to idle cutoff, throttle to idle, carb heat is in, our fuel selector is on, trim is set to takeoff. We'll check that the prop is clear, we'll get the door closed, open up the window, call clear prop, head down here, turn on the master and the alternator, check the fuel tank left and right. We got 3/4 of a tank, matched what I measured in the wings. We've got the beacon on. We'll bring the mixture into full rich, bring the throttle in 1/8 of an inch, and we'll prime it. 1, 2, 3 strokes of the primer. Check again that the prop is clear, feet are on the brakes, keys are in the ignition. Can't get rid of these ground guys though. Turn it over. Alright, you can see the oil pressure there is in the green, so we've got a good start with the oil pressure. We'll check our RPMs. They're just above 1,000. We'll bring that back to 1,000. And now that we've got a good start, we can lean the mixture for ground operations. Alright, all the switches look good down there. We'll head up here and turn on our avionics. So COM1, COM2. We've got 1228, which is CTAF, 12095, Wilkes-Barre approach, 1215 guard, and that's Wilkes-Barre Tower on standby 12010. We'll bring up the flaps and verify that they are both coming up. Excuse me, Monica. Now we will set the altimeter to field elevation. Normally get that from the weather, and we'll dial that into the autopilot here. We're not going to be using that, but that'll set the barometer for it. Since we have a heading bug, I will set it to our runway that we'll be using, which is 25. That all looks good. Now we'll get our taxi and our landing light on. And once this fellow gets out of the way, we'll make our CTAF call. Wyoming Valley traffic, Cessna 565 Whiskey, taxi from the ramp to runway 7, hold short, Wyoming Valley. Release the parking brake. I'll test my brakes. They work. Now I know the placard on the airplane has a different call sign than 565 Whiskey. That's because I didn't update it in Flight Simulator, but the livery we're flying is 565 Whiskey, so that's what I'll use. As we are turning here, we're going to look for our turn and slip coordinator turning, our directional turning, our attitude indicator remaining level, and our compass turning. I'm going to stop here at 927 before crossing. Check out the windsock. It's really hard to see here. I'm going to turn around though and look at the one on the school, and that is pointing to 25. So we're going to do our run up here before back taxiing to 5. Parking brake is set. Elevator up, elevator down, left rudder, right aileron down, left aileron down. That all looks good. We'll bring in the mixture to full rich for run up. And throttle up to 1700. We're going to do our mag check. So as we do our mag check here, mag left and mag right, the drop is fine, but you kind of get that pulsing sound with the JP Logistics mod sometimes. And I'll skip over all the troubleshooting I do here with putting carb heat on and doing a cleanup for the mags. None of that helps. I actually think it's just because the engine is cold, and that's what that's simulating. Wyoming Valley traffic, Cessna 565 Whiskey, back taxi, runway 25, Wyoming Valley. As we back taxi here, I have to point out that I am not a flight instructor, and this is not for real-world flight instruction. This is just how to fly the pattern in the simulator in the most realistic manner possible. Also, the speeds I'm using are approximate, and they are what works for me in the sim. They're not necessarily the V speeds for a Cessna 152 or the power settings. Valley traffic, Cessna 565 Whiskey, departing runway 25, remaining in the pattern, Wyoming Valley. Alright, airspeed's coming alive. We're looking for 55 knots to rotate, and I'll pop up an overlay from Cloud Ahoy that has the actual flight track for this loop around the circuit, so you can see where we're at in the pattern. So we are up and I'm going to pitch for VY, which is 70 knots. I've got a trim wheel on my controller, and I'm going to make use of it to help me out. Get a little bit of nose up trim to get that 70. And now I'm going to watch the altimeter and keep on climbing, managing my airspeed until I get to 500 feet above pattern altitude. So we're looking for 500 to 700 feet. At my flight school, we typically use 500 feet at both ends. That works out well. We do have a delta airspace very close to us at one end. And 500 feet keeps you a little bit closer to the runway in terms of the size of the pattern in the event of an engine out failure. 700 feet has its bonuses too, but we're turning at 5 and it usually works out pretty nicely. So now we are making a left on to the crosswind, and we'll say Valley traffic, 565 Whiskey, left crosswind, runway 25, Wyoming Valley. So this is a climbing turn, and I'm squaring off the airplane, so I'm 90 degrees with the runway, so I keep looking back at the tail and the runway to visually figure out where I am, and I'm just at pattern altitude now, so I'm going to push down the nose and pull back the power to 2,000 RPMs. And that should level me off, and I've already used up the crosswind, so we're turning left onto the downwind. And I know I've used up the crosswind because I'm at a 45-degree angle over my left shoulder to the end of the runway. Valley traffic, 565 Whiskey, left, downwind, runway 25, Wyoming Valley. So we're making a left turn, and I'm going to roll out when I'm parallel to the runway. This is about a half mile from the runway. And if you've got a nice high wing with a brace, like the Cessna 152 here, then the runway should roughly bisect the brace. You can see I overshot my pattern altitude just a little bit, but my spacing looks good for the runway because I'm about halfway up the strut there. The trick here is knowing the power settings for your aircraft, so 2000 RPM gives me 80 knots in the downwind. Now I'm abeam at the touchdown point, so I'm going to pull the power back to 1500. Verify that I'm in the arc for flaps, put in my first notch of flaps, and pull out the carb heat for my descent. And then I'm going to start descending here, looking over my shoulder for the 45-degree angle between the aircraft and the end of the runway. And here we are. So we're going to make our left turn onto base. Valley traffic, 565 Whiskey, left base, runway 25, touch and go, Wyoming Valley. Now it just so happens the 8th Street Bridge right ahead is pretty close to where the turn for the base is when you're at the 45-degree, but I'm not using the bridge, I'm using the 45-degree angle because the bridge isn't going to be at every airport I go to. On the base leg here, I'm going to put in my second notch of flaps. There it is, verify that that's coming down. And I want to have a nice 500 foot per minute descent rate. And if I do everything right, I want to roll out on to final at 500 feet above ground. There's the field. You're going to keep watching that. Get ready to roll out onto final. 500 feet above ground is about 1,000 feet. Remember, that was also where we turned on the departure leg to turn on to crosswind. And we're just a tad low as we turn here onto final. Now I'm going to pick my aiming point, and I'm using the numbers for this touchdown. I've got my 500 foot per minute descent rate. Actually, it's going a little bit too fast as we try to sort out our speeds here. So now we're decreasing our speed. We've got our last notch of flaps coming in here. We're shooting for 60 on short final here in the C152, and we're actually getting a little bit low. So I'm bringing a little power to bring myself up. Now we got the runway made. Keel the power. And we're down. So we're doing a touch and go. We're going to bring up the flaps, put the carb heat in, go to full power, and once we hit rotate speed, we're going to rotate. So for this next round, I'll just show you a montage of some of the turns. So at 1,000 feet, we're going to do a left turn onto our crosswind again. If you saw my last video, this was the decision point where if you had an engine failure before this point, I would land in the soccer field that's straight ahead. Now we're on the downwind leg. We're going to line ourselves up parallel with the runway again. We did a better job of hitting pattern altitude on this second go. We're right at 1500 on the dot with a vertical speed of 0. Now we're turning left on to the base, and you can see from the track that we're just a little bit past the 8th Street Bridge on this, so we're a bit wide on our pattern. Turned a little early here for final. Get ourselves back on final, manage our airspeed. We got our 60 knots. Still getting used to my new flight controller. As we touch down, we'll come to a stop, back taxi, and do a short field takeoff. And I'll overlay the last takeoff next to the current takeoff so you can see the difference in climb, attitude, and performance. So the difference is we're going to climb at VX instead of VY. VY is 70 knots, VX is 58 knots. So we're really going to pitch up, get our 58 knots, and then once we clear that obstacle, which is coming up, now we're going to pitch down until we get to our VY speed of 70 knots. And you can see that change right on the overlay for the flight track. And now we're doing a normal climb for the departure leg. We're going to turn crosswind as normal. As we come up on 1,000 feet. Now we're in the downwind, lined up parallel to the runway. Looking good, maybe a little bit wide, but not too bad. Now we're in the base leg, keeping our eye on the runway. Rolling out just at 1,000 feet onto final with a 500 foot per minute descent rate, which looks good. And we're just doing a normal landing for this one. This approach is looking pretty good. And we're down. So that's what flying the pattern is like, and I find in the simulator it's actually not that different than in real life. The speeds, RPM settings, maybe the way the aircraft descends are a bit different than they are in real life, and you just have to translate that into the simulator and get used to it. And the turn radius of the aircraft I find is bigger in the sim than it is in real life, so that takes getting used to as well. But you can fly a very similar pattern in the sim, and if you were to overlay the flight track from a real life pattern, it doesn't look that different. So it's kind of cool. We're going to stop here at the gas pumps, and the trick for these particular pumps is halfway up the strut, just like the runway. Gives me the proper spacing. So I hope you enjoy realistic general aviation content like this. If you do, be sure to click that like button, leave me a comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks, as always, for flying along with me, and stay tuned for further flight adventures.